Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to a new week of Dollar Bin Bandits episodes. I'm Mike Farah. We hope you had an amazing Thanksgiving, and now we are back at it, giving you interviews with the best and brightest that comics has to offer. And that includes today's guest, a returning guest. His name is Chris Ryall, and you probably know him best as the former president and publisher of IDW, but he has a whole slew of projects that have either just come out or just coming out. Great to pick up for the holidays, and we get into all of them. They are the deluxe edition of The Origins of Marvel Comics, which is a book that was published with Stan Lee, doing the intros and contextualizing the first origins of Marvel heroes that you know and love. Of course, because it's a deluxe edition, it's kind of souped up with all kinds of essays and extra material. So definitely want to check that out. There is also another Marvel project, another sort of retrospective, and that is the Mighty Marvel Calendar book, a visual history. And that book reprints all of the calendars from the mid 70s to early 80s, where Marvel was doing these very informative calendars with a lot of original art and just spectacular stuff. And then we have a book, a comic book this time, that is out now, from Chris's imprint Syzygy and Image, and it's called Dread the Halls. What is it, you may ask? Well, of course, it's a horror holiday themed comic anthology. It's got a lot of different stories, including one written by Chris, and you should go pick that up. So without further ado, let's get into all of these projects with Chris Ryall. Chris Ryall to the program. Chris, how you doing?
Good, Mike. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again. So you have a number of different projects that are hitting in the holiday season of 2024, some of which have come out, one of which is, by the time this episode comes out, may have come out. And we'd like to talk to you about all three because they're all three are very interesting, and we think people should be aware of them and pick them up for gifts and whatnot, even if it's a gift for yourself, which is always the best kind. So, first one we wanted to jump into is the deluxe edition of The Origins of Marvel Comics, which is a book that forwarded or contextualized by Stan Lee, but gives a sort of a reprint of a number of the origin issues of some of the characters. And you sort of brought it up to speed with better production. It's the 50th anniversary. Tell me a little bit about your background and experience with this book, and what it meant to you as a project to take on.
Yeah, I saw a copy of it when I was a kid, and I loved it from the start. It was one of those things where, as I came to find out, this was the very first ever collection of Marvel comics in a bookstore ready format. So I have the deluxe edition in my hand, but the original's back on a shelf over here too. And what it was, like you say, it was the origin stories of most all of their key characters. So it was the Fantastic Four and the Hulk, Spider-Man, Thor, Doctor Strange, and the Submariner. And what they did was they presented not only the first issue, like the first appearance of those characters, but then a more then modern version of those characters as well. So you got two stories per character basically. So you got to see what the Fantastic Four looked like when they were first created in 1961, and then there was a later issue to kind of compare and see how like Stanley and Jack Kirby had progressed as they worked on the book over the years. And yeah, like you say, the book itself, and then every one of the chapters was introduced by Stan Lee, and it became a bit of a controversial book over the years in that Stan was much more gracious to himself and his own contributions, on these characters than he maybe was to his artists, and the co-creators on these characters. And so, some people took great exception to it for that reason. Like as kids, all we saw was that it was Stan Lee sort of inviting you into the Marvel bullpen and into the Marvel family in ways that you just didn't really have, from other things that we read. And so this was a book that not only kind of legitimized comics to our parents by seeing it on sale in bookstores, but also we could go to the library and check out this book over and over again and just immerse yourself in these stories. And so for me, it sort of was one of the foundational texts that made me really care about Marvel and their characters.
Was this a project that came to you, or was this something that you were thinking about that you pitched, knowing that it was the 50th anniversary?
It was one I wanted to long before there was any anniversary coming up. When I was at IDW, part of what we did was a lot of archival editions and preservation of older comic material. And so this was one where I wanted to find ways to bring it back into print because while you've got access to these stories any number of ways now, there was still something special about this book from its painted John Romita cover through all the, like I say, the fun, if one-sided Stan Lee text bits, to the organization of the stories, and just all that together was such a cool package. And then the book had been out of print for a few decades. It was last reissued in 1997. They did new editions with then modern covers that kind of felt tonally just disconnected to the contents. And so I wanted to do just a replica edition of the original book. And what that became in working with Simon and Schuster finally this over the last couple of years was, doing a deluxe edition, which became a much more celebratory thing, where I invited in collaborators like Alex Ross, who painted the new cover, Tom Brevoort, Larry Lieber, who worked on Thor's first appearance in the book, found the original editor on this book line, the Fireside line back in the day, a woman named Linda Sunshine, who kind of flew a bit under the radar, even though she was very instrumental in creating the entire collected edition sort of part of the comic business. Like I say, Marvel stuff was not collected and sold in bookstores or distributed in libraries up until this book. And so, it became an important book in addition to just being a fun thing that I wanted to bring back in print.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do
Sure.
you have a favorite of the origin tales that are presented in this book?
Oh, that's not putting me on the spot as much as some of the other conversations around the book have, very much focused in on the Stan Lee text and the certain factions that feel the need to pick sides have decided that I'm, becoming an apologist for Stan Lee, which clearly isn't the case. Like this book we weren't trying to make a historical corrective or anything like that, but we did want to celebrate the collaborative aspect of all these different stories. The work that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did together, the work that Stan and Steve Ditko did. How all these people together sort of created this entire universe that we're still talking about. So many decades later. So I don't know. I was a Fantastic Four kid. Like the first comic I ever read was the Fantastic Four, and so that was the one that probably meant the most to me in this book too. I eventually got to a point where I, got to meet and work with Stan Lee to some degree, got a copy of Fantastic Four #1. So that's always been the story that's kind of loomed largest for me.
Now, how did you choose? You mentioned that you have a number of folks contributing ancillary or additional material to the book, some essays, Alex Ross's cover. How did you decide or choose who was going to um, be part of, this kind of historical document?
It was mostly trying to find people that had a connection to the specific book or these stories. And so in the case of Linda Sunshine, the original editor, it was important to talk to her because she was the one who, like I said, got this all started. Um, I originally reached out to Alex just to contribute a new cover, and he did a great cover. He did sort of a takeoff of John Romita's cover, but he did the thing because John Romita's cover originally just showed Stan Lee's hands at a typewriter and all the characters sort of springing out of it. Um, Alex made a subtle but kind of pointed addition of putting a hand, painting the Doctor Strange figure, like it's Steve Ditko's hand, and there's Jack Kirby's hand finishing Thor. And so that was how we addressed the idea of the creators all working together and deserving equal credit on these stories was just by making sure they were all equally represented. And so Alex was just going to do the cover. And then I said, well, I'd love to do the process stuff. Like Alex's process pieces are always so great. Like his pencil pieces are publishable on their own. And then the color pieces he does before the painting are wonderful. And so I wanted to show all of that, all the different references that he used for the characters' poses, sometimes himself, posing like a character just so he can get the right lighting down. And then he also wanted to contribute a piece that talked a bit more about the Marvel method, the way that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and some of the other writers and artists all work together and their method for creating these stories. Alongside that, Tom Brevoort's probably the senior most editor at Marvel. And so he did a piece that also talked about like the specific backstory about the stories that are included in the book. And then like getting Larry Lieber, probably the only living creator who touched one of the stories that's contained in this book, was a huge thrill. Like I'd never met him before, never even talked to him before. And he just turned 93. And so, getting him to tell a story about working with his brother Stan and with Jack Kirby on the creation of Thor was great. And then at the New York Comic Con in October, I got to hand him a copy of the book. We got to meet and walk around Marvel Comics offices together. And so just involving him, like I say, this piece of living history was a real thrill.
Yeah, he particularly is a big get. I mean, all of them are. We've only had the opportunity to talk to, besides you, Tom Brevoort, and
Mm,
who is just a font of knowledge about Marvel
absolutely.
and all things comics in general. But it's great to have this sort of additional, color commentary, so to speak, on what is, a historical document. And I'm glad you did mention that. This wasn't meant to be a corrective and wasn't meant to wade into this sort of controversial waters, because it really is at its core a reprint of a book that, happened and was chronicling sort of the beginnings of Marvel, at least these characters. So
And it's a
I
celebration of that book
sure.
too, and so it's also intended to be a celebration of the creators. And so the great thing was all the different pieces I thought worked together to tell one story. Linda talked about the creation of this book line, and Tom and Alex talked about the creator process, and then you got Alex's cover process, Larry talking about working with the other creators on one of the stories. And so all told, like it became this big celebration of what all these different people at the Marvel bullpen back in the day created together.
I wanted to ask about your role or the role of an editor on a project like this, because to a layperson or a reader, you think of, well, it's, a big chunk of it is a reprint. So the editor's role is more with the additional material. Is that the right way to think
Yeah.
about it? Or do you look at the old stuff in some other way or how to present it or anything? Or is it really just being true to that? Original material and then adding again the ancillary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there were like if there were errors on the original book, or like if a word balloon dropped off or something like that, we made sure that all the files were correct, certainly. But otherwise, I wanted the guts of the book to be a straight replica edition. So, like for instance, there's in the introduction from Stan where he's talking about the Spider-Man stories, he mentions Electro, and he mentions a story in the book that features Spider-Man fighting Electro, and then you read the story, you're like, wait a minute, he's fighting the Shocker. That's not like they both have electricity based powers, but
Yeah.
it's a totally different character. And so, because there were different printings of the book back in the day, one of which had the Electro story, one of which then had the Shocker story subbed in, and they never adjusted the text. And so we talked about, well, do we correct that? Do we put in the story that Stan referred to, or do we keep the book as it was? And we wanted to keep the book as it was because again, once you start sort of messing with things to a degree, then it's no longer a replica edition. It becomes like our version of what those original people that put the book together intended. And I didn't want that. So I basically made sure that all the pages were in order, certainly. And then all the additional content, going out and asking and getting, Linda and Tom and Alex and Larry to contribute their pieces. I wrote the introduction to the book, and then I wrote all the back matter too. So there's an extended section of original art, of original ads, concept pieces, additional process pieces. We found all the original poses or covers and things that John Romita referenced when he drew the original cover. We looked at some of the sketches that didn't quite pass muster for the original cover art, and so I put all of those pieces together and assembled the entire book. So yeah, it's very hands on front to back, even though we're not necessarily correcting anything on the original edition.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to have, it's not an interpretive edition. It's a, and truly to form, it's a deluxe edition and it sounds like there's just a lot of great material in there and things to read and things to think
Yeah.
about and art to new or sort of older art that to rediscover. So sounds like a great package. That one is from I think Simon and Schuster.
Simon Schuster, yeah, through their gallery imprint, they basically are restarting the Fireside line. And so this is, yeah, the first of what will hopefully become multiple Fireside Marvel releases all over again.
Are you in touch to do more of them, all of them, some of them?
I would certainly like to. We've talked about these things. It's one of those things where, if there is an announcement to be made that they have to be the ones to make it, but I
Sure.
would certainly like to see all of these things back in print. Yeah.
Okay. Can't blame me for trying to break news.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Let's move on to your other Marvel book, which is also kind of an archival project. It's called the Mighty Marvel Calendar Book of Visual History. Came out also in October. There it is.
An
Um,
even bigger prop. Yeah.
exactly. That actually strikes a chord with me. I don't think I had it, but it's just so memorable a visual that I must have at least seen it, if not had it. And so that came out through Abrams in October, of course, available now. Um, how did you get involved in that project? Again, was it something they came to you? Was it something you were thinking about yourself?
It's something I want to do also for quite a while. Like I love those old calendars. There was a 7 year period where Marvel treated their calendars like every bit of the calendar was treated like a piece of art. And so on the calendar grid itself, you didn't just get a white, page with a bunch of squares that break down, the days of the week and stuff, and maybe mention a holiday here or there. Every one of the squares was filled with, I don't know, comic book trivia or quotes from one of the books or photos of the staffers who worked on them or the writers and artists. And back in the day, again, like you didn't know what anybody looked like. You never saw pictures of anybody outside of maybe Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And so that was the first time I ever saw pictures of what some of the creators that worked on these things looked like. And so every page of these calendars sort of served to again bring you further into like the Marvel family and sort of, I don't know, peek behind the curtain to some degree and get a sense of the people making the stuff as well as the stuff itself. And then for the pieces of art, they hired all of the best artists that they had working back in the day to do these all new pieces of art that largely have never been reprinted. And so for decades, they've just not been seen again. But there's great pieces of art by everybody from, I don't know, Jack Kirby to Mike Plug to John Byrne, John Buscema, Frank Miller, Michael Golden, on and on and on, just like the top people working at Marvel. And so I wanted to just see all of that brought back into print so people could see these things that were kind of this weird little corner of Marvel's merchandise way back in the day. And so I tried to do this again back at IDW, and we couldn't get the scans to replicate properly. The calendars were all spiral bound, so either you tear the pages off the spiral binding, in which case you've created all this weird shredded stuff at the top that needs restoration, or you can't quite flatten the spiral down to scan. So anyway, like just the restoration itself was really challenging. And so it never came to pass until Abrams not only was interested, but then I got working with a restoration guy named David Banks, who was able to scan, sort of retouch all the colors, clean up any kind of blemishes and I don't know scratches, any kind of marks that were on these calendars over the last decades. And so he made these perfect replicas of the images themselves, and then a designer named Sean Lee, who's won an Eisner for a book he created a few years ago, this Madman Deluxe Edition book. Sean was the designer on the book, and so he and I assembled the whole thing together, and yeah, it became this 13 by 13, 300-page beast of a book. Couldn't be happier with it. Like again, it's one of those things where taking childhood stuff that I loved and finding a cool way to sort of repackage it and reintroduce it to people.
Now, I didn't quite see on what you held up. Do you still have the spiral bound
No,
this, or is it
we
just a
added this
approximation?
just an approximation. Yeah,
Okay.
we talked about that. We even talked about reformatting the book so it would open. vertically instead of
Right.
horizontally, but it would weigh, 30 pounds and tear a hole in your wall if you tried to hang it. And so we oriented the images and the calendar grid side by side. And so it's a very, I don't know, pleasant reading experience to go through and look at all that old stuff. And like I said, I introduced each one of the years and explained why the images were special, why each of the calendars and their specific themes were distinctive, and just pointed out all the little bits of, I don't know, curiosity and trivia. And again, like finding original art, old ads and other process pieces and things like that to include in the back too.
How difficult was it to do that latter part in terms of getting the research, finding the art, which, to your point, hadn't been in print and for so long might not, you know, be in existence or might be buried somewhere? Was that a difficult process to kind of dig all that out and make it print ready?
Well, it's so partly the calendars themselves. Like I owned the calendars, and so that was easy enough to get those scanned and cleaned up. Some of the backup material you can find through either private collectors or like through Heritage. In some cases, I scanned old ads from comics, and we cleaned those up. But one of the weirdest sort of happenstance things that came about toward the end was we had to remove a few of the letters for various, internal reasons that couldn't be included in the book. Letters from like the editor to some of the creators or things like that. And so I was trying to like find ways to fill the pages right when I noticed an auction ended for 2 years worth of process art for the 78 and 79 calendars, which every piece of those was handwritten by the editor on those two calendars, who's a guy named David Anthony Kraft. And so he did these detailed sketches of what he wanted the art to look like, but he also hand drew every single calendar grid for each month and wrote in, all the details he wanted, all the quotes, a little caricature of the artist he wanted included in there. And just seeing that stuff, like seeing just the hand drawn aspect of these things back in the pre computer days, made you aware of not only what a cool labor of love they were, but also just what a huge production challenge it must have been, because you didn't have the easy means to just cut and paste things. Like you had to literally cut and then by hand paste things down. And so including a lot of David Kraft's hand-drawn pieces, I think was just such a cool curiosity, because those again hadn't been seen really ever. They were in possession of David's widow, and so Jennifer, she was great about sharing the one she had. And then once the auction closed, I got a hold of the auction winner, who was kind enough to send them all to me and let me scan them and clean, and include them in the book. And so it became a very cool extra that was completely unexpected, other than just a last minute find, like I say.
For Marvel, these only existed in this form for a set amount of time, right? It was 9 years,
7 years, yeah,
7 years.
75 to 81.
Do you have, and maybe it's in the book, sort of the impetus for starting the calendars, and then also why did they end after only 7 years?
Talking to Roy Thomas was the guy who wrote and sort of created the calendar line back in 75. And he wrote the introduction for the book. And he just said, like, they were so time consuming, and like, this is one of those things that you did on top of your job. It wasn't like you could take time off of working on books or being the editor in chief and just do this stuff in a vacuum. Like, you did this around all the day job demands, and like having had similar roles, and trying to find time to do extracurricular things. I know what a challenge that was, even in a post computer era. And so I understand why it became a thing where just no longer they could justify the time and probably the expense of putting these together. And so, they became, yeah, just like I say, the 7 year curiosity. Why they did them originally, it was a weird time of just all this, like, I don't know, invention and sort of experimentation in the mass marketplace. So, Marvel was doing things like much more merchandising. So there were, I don't know, t-shirts and board games and stickers and trading cards and, things like the origin book and stationery, and the calendars, I think, were another part of that, just ways to kind of elevate the artwork, the stories, the characters into the mass market in ways that comic books themselves weren't really doing at the time. And so this was their way to kind of marvelize the thing that, everybody was hanging wall calendars in their homes or their offices back in the day, but it largely was just a piece of stock art. Or even if other comic publishers like DC were doing them, it was maybe a cover reproduction, but they weren't doing things that had sort of this level of originality in them, like the Marvel calendars. So I love that they took the time and the expense and everything to do that. But like I say, yeah, I understand why it's not a thing that is still happening today.
It seems like it's a perfect project for, and this was pre the advent of this kind of department, special projects, which
Yeah, yeah.
like we've talked to Bob Budiansky, who
Mm,
was, head of special projects at some point. I'm sure there have been others, and he did the trading cards and basically anything that
yeah.
wasn't a comic would be under special projects. But this was pre the time when you would even have somebody in that position. So it sort of fell to all the folks that were just making the comics anyway, including Roy, who I was going to ask how he was involved, but it seems like he was sort of heading this and other projects in his capacities as editor in the 70s.
Yeah, so he wrote the first one and then he handed it off to, I believe Tony Isabella wrote the bicentennial calendar, and then an editor named Jim Salicrup, and then David Kraft wrote 79 and or 78 and 79 calendars. And so it sort of changed hands after Roy did the first one, and the format changed a little bit over the years. The 81 most noticeably was different in that like it didn't have creator photos and things like that anymore. Um, the funny thing is, so years ago, I tried basically replicating this format when we were publishing all the Hasbro titles, because at that point it was like, all right, well, there's enough different properties now to warrant, making a full calendar, and you could do enough different character images to, fill 12 good months. And it became such a thing that, first of all, was way too laborious. Like I just couldn't find time to pull it all together, but also everything becomes a bit more fraught in terms of, well, you can't include this creator, or that quote you can't use because, there just becomes sort of bigger business or corporate or legal reasons why you can't do this or shouldn't include that, or need to, if you include this. It's kind of like planning a wedding. Like if you invite these people, you have to then invite these people. And so
Right.
it almost became a thing where like the gridlock around what could or couldn't work became so top heavy that it's like, well, I don't think this is actually going to be able to happen. And so I also love that like this period of Marvel's history was not only full of experimentation, but also they just didn't have the rules and the structure and the levels of people to tell them, no, don't do that. They just did stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it does sound like a fun freewheeling time before sort of corporate interests, took
And
hold.
I'm sure at times that came back and bit them too,
Right.
because that's sort of how it goes. But I liked that, yeah, that these things could exist for a time, even if you eventually understand why they couldn't keep happening forever.
Yeah. That segues into another question, which is about both of these projects. They're different, but they're very similar. They're taking a look back at Marvel, in a historical perspective. What makes now sort of the right time for these types of projects? And was it just happenstance that they kind of came together at the same time?
Yeah, totally. In fact, that they came out like they were released about 2 weeks apart. Even though I worked on them over like I don't know, a 2 to 2.5 year period, like all told between the two books, is just kind of a funny quirk of publishing that they came out so close together. But I love that they came out, in the fall, so they're both available and ready for the holiday shopping season if anybody's so inclined. Um, and I don't, it kind of feels like along the lines of doing other preservation work, like Scott Doombeer's Artist Edition line, or
Mhm.
doing these high-end strip reprint books of all the old newspaper strips. It just kind of going not really decade by decade, but finding all these cool things that people talk about in reverential tones, or that people cite as like these cool things that were there then gone, and just finding ways to hopefully bring them back around just to show people all the different parts of the business. We've gotten real good at collecting the stories themselves, but it's always a bit more like it requires more excavating to sometimes put books together that include all of these weird little side corners of the comic business. And I love it for that reason. Like I love finding these things and, like I say, exposing them to people where they might have heard about the calendar. They might have, like you say, seen that image before, but most people haven't seen them. And so it's fun to see their reaction when they not only see the size of the book, but then it's hard to explain that when you're doing a book of calendars. People go, oh, so was it art? I'm like, no, no, it's way more than that. So they don't really kind of grasp it until you can show them what each of the pages and, the way they handled the grids, how it all looked. And so it becomes a thing where when you see it, it's like, oh yeah, that's very cool. That deserves to be preserved in book form.
Yeah, I wonder if you would consider the calendar book to be an art book, because it certainly has a lot of original art or art that's not in other places. But yet, it is chronicling something that was ultimately supposed to be somewhat functional. Uh, so would you, I mean, in its current form, I think it's probably leans more towards an art book, although the
Yeah,
original calendars probably would not be considered an art thing. Is that how
right.
you think about it?
Yeah, I think because every one of those, like the calendar grids, I think are kind of their own piece of art, even if they're not attributable to an artist per se. Like the artist is the production staff at Marvel. Um, but yeah, we treated each page of each calendar like its own art piece and artifact, and explained not only who worked on it to the best degree that we could find, everybody responsible for each one, but also, just like I introduced each year with text pieces. But yeah, it's 250 plus pages are just art pieces with reading, like you could read all the quotes and the cool stuff on the grids. But yeah, it's very much an art book and a celebration of the art and the artistry that went into making them.
Yeah. They're both very cool projects and very cool, physical objects. And so we encourage everybody to go out and check them out. Buy them for yourself, buy them for others. Your third project that is holiday timed is not a book, um, or not a large book, and not from Marvel. It's a one-shot Christmas horror comic called Dread the Halls from Image. Um, Tell us a little bit about it.
So it comes out on December 4th. Yeah, it's a 48-page one shot. So it's an anthology with four different stories in it, three of which are written by a writer named Jordan Hart, who is the co-writer of a book I published under my image imprint Syzygy. He and another writer, David Ebeltop, wrote a book called The Cabinet. And so Jordan and I, it's funny, like this book is certainly not a Marvel project, but it's attributable to a Marvel book in the past, in that Jordan and I have sort of long bonded over our love of old comics and old covers. And there's this book that Marvel did back in, I think it was like 83, called Bizarre Adventures. One of the issues they did was dedicated to Christmas horror stories. And like we both love that and have talked about ways to, try to do something similar. And so finally we just decided, yeah, this is the year. Let's do something that is just all kinds of different holiday related horror stories. And so, like I say, he contributed three of them. I wrote one. Mine is with an artist named Lee Ferguson. And yeah, we just like did our best to kind of emulate, that old book by telling these Christmas or, winter holiday related horror stories.
Without spoiling anything, could you tell us a little bit about your story or your contribution to this collection? And also, where did you get the idea? Was it something you had in your back pocket, or it kind of came to you?
It was inspired by another old thing, which is the cover to an old EC comic called Panic. First issue is this kid who sets this like vicious bear trap under his fireplace hearth, and you see Santa's foot starting to come down the chimney. You're like, oh shit! Um, and so we did a takeoff on that cover. Lee Ferguson, my artist, did a takeoff on that cover for this Dread the Halls book. Um, Two kids, and they're basically trying to hook Santa with a big gingerbread cookie that's, connected to a fishing line that they're holding on to the other end of it. And so the story follows suit. It's called Gone Fishing, and it's these two 10-year-old kids who set out on Christmas Eve to catch Santa Claus, thinking that if they can catch him and sort of keep him for themselves, then they can have toys year round. And it takes a terrible turn as the kids find out that maybe Santa's not the only one coming down people's chimneys on Christmas Eve, and so it kind of goes onward from there. And like I say, it takes a suitably dark, playful turn, but very much like in the spirit of an old EC comic.
Had you worked with Lee Ferguson before, or is this your first
Um,
collaboration?
Only overseeing, like Lee did some D&D comics that Sal Buscema inked back in the day. I wasn't the direct editor on it, but I kind of helped assemble the team. And then Lee also did some GI Joe comics back in the day when I was the editor in chief, and so I got to know him that way, but we never worked directly as writer artist on anything before.
Is this the kind of thing that might become an annual tradition? Do you think there might be some other stories that could be kind of unlocked in 2025, 2026?
I would say 100% that's accurate. Yeah. In fact, we have a thing planned that's not necessarily a December release next year, but that's going to be connected to the sort of Dread the Halls. I wouldn't call it a line just yet, but yeah, there will certainly be more.
Very cool. Um, so that coming to kind of the conclusion of the three Chris Ryall led projects that have happened all around this holiday time. What if you can, talk about anything, is coming up in 2025 for you that fans can look forward to?
Well, so partly through the image imprint. So the imprint Syzygy is a thing that
Syzygy,
my
yeah.
partner Ashley Wood and I started, and so we occasionally do some books through there, either together or separate, um, but also publish other people's books. So I've been doing a book for a while with writers Owen King and Jesse Kellerman called Self Help. They finished first 5 issue run, and the second 5 issue starts in the spring. And there's a few other new books that'll be starting in the spring and summer. So that imprint will keep going, and then at the same time, sort of along the lines of these Marvel archival books, there's more of those kinds of projects in the works. And on top of all of that, I'm finishing up a graphic novel, not really a straight adaptation, but a version of Megalopolis with Francis Ford Coppola and artist Jacob Phillips that will be out at some point in 2025 too.
And we're back. Well, if that's not a holiday gift list in an episode, I don't know what is. It was great of Chris to expand upon what these projects have inside of them, how they all came about, what he was thinking when he put a lot of the extra material together, and happy to hear the Dread the Halls kind of format might happen again and again and again. I really like, these short stories and ones that have sort of a thematic resonance with either holidays or a time of year. So looking forward to that. But that'll do it for today's episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing, and we'll see you next issue.